watching another individual executing an action with modulation of that activity shown in this area here in the brain cutout model, when the context of the observed action reveals the intention. So here, hard to see the small slide, but things are kind of spilled and messed about, so easier to interpret that this is a cleaning up of a food scene, a dinner scene, so that modulates the degree of activity. Now, the motor neuron areas discovered in monkeys and replicated in fMRI studies of humans have anatomic connections to an area called the anterior insula, shown here, pulling away the sylvian fissure, revealing the underlying cortex, deep and folded. And also in this area, as I'll mention in just a moment, a lot of input from the viscera. In fact, it's a viscerotopically organized area of cortex. Lamb and colleagues, and now several others, replicating with different kind of designs, the basically same finding, showed that when observing facial expressions of someone else in pain, here the cover story was, this was someone with a rare auditory disorder. It was being treated with very loud sound that created a painful experience. That observation of pain in someone else activated areas that were involved in one's own affective response to pain, particularly here the anterior insula and the anterior medial cingulate cortex, and that manipulations of things like perspective, imagining it's the self versus the other, or appraisal manipulations, imagining that this treatment is effective versus unsuccessful, modulated these particular responses. There, we've cut away from the brain to be able to see the insular cortex a little better, and here dissected it out so you can see these various portions of the central insular sulcus, the long insular gyri, and then the short insular gyri. So this viscerotopic mapping in that area, a bringing together, it would appear, of information from the body with information that's coming in from external stimuli, playing an important role, many theorists posit, in a kind of embodiment of emotional experience. And in the case of these pain observation studies, a simulation of the experience that oneself has in pain. What do mirror neurons and the anterior insula have to do with cultivation of compassion in these contemplative traditions, particularly Buddhist meditative practice? Mirror neurons? One example here comes from Richie Davidson's laboratory at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, with Antoine Lutz as the senior investigator in this. They studied expert Vajrayana, Tibetan Buddhist meditators, expert by virtue of the number of hours of practice, more than 10,000 hours of meditation practice, which, by the way, is a kind of interesting number, because you find in the literature expertise in a number of different domains, whether it's athletic performance or musical performance, often somewhere right around 10,000 hours of practice required to develop that expertise. So they compared them to meditation novices, just given a brief bit of training, and what they found was greater activation to emotional vocalization, screams, cries, in this insular cortex during what was called non-referential compassion meditation, basically a kind of open monitoring meditation, not specifically attentionally focused, but infused with the intention of kindness and compassion to all beings, not focused on some particular being, kindness and compassion to all beings, common practice within this particular Buddhist tradition. Also found that the strength of that insula activation correlated with these practitioners' self-reported intensity of the meditation. So here you can see plotted the actual blood oxygen level responses with the meditators and novices, meditators in red, novices shown in blue. Well, if the automatic activation of shared experience, this mirror neuron coupled with these viscerotopic emotion areas, were all that empathy was about, then responses would likely be simply oriented to the self. It would feel like what happens when I'm in pain or I'm distressed. So something else needs to be present for a mature kind of empathy or compassion to emerge, rather than simply empathic over-arousal and distress, the kind of thing we see in younger children in emotional contagion. So there's been considerable work in social psychology as well as developmental psychology on this particular topic. C. Daniel Batson and his colleagues doing work demonstrating that self-focused perspective taking arouses more intense empathic distress. This is by subjective report, and also some studies then showing its physiologic manifestations accompanying that. And Nancy Eisenberg up at ASU and her colleagues doing a number of studies showing that those who have greater physiologic emotional response to others' distress tend to be more self-focused, less empathic, and less altruistic in their responses to others' distress. So maybe a little counterintuitive. One would think that these are the individuals who maybe are more empathically attuned. They're showing higher arousal. But that's what flips into this dimension of empathic distress or empathic over-arousal. That's an unpleasant experience, and the impulse in such unpleasant experience is to turn away, not to engage with the individual who's suffering. Also important is the ability to shift perspective and take the perspective of the other. Be aware of that other person may be seeing things differently than I am. And here all of the studies having to do with mentalizing or theory of mind become important. So I think most of you are familiar with these kinds of tasks. This particular one is called the Sally Ann task. This is Sally, this is Ann. Sally puts a ball in the basket. She goes away and then moves the ball to her box. Sally comes back on the scene. Where will Sally look for her ball? If you're a 3-year-old, you're going to say in the box, because you haven't developed that ability to shift perspective. Older children and adults correctly say that Sally is going to look in the basket because that's what she saw when she was there. If you do this in related kinds of tasks with both older children and adults, you find evidence of activation within the medial prefrontal cortex, shown here in the enclosed squares and triangle, right in the same area where various kinds of self-relevant experiences occur or result in activation, like tickling, various kinds of emotion stimulus situations, pain, self-action. Also within this inferior parietal, superior temporal cortical area that seems to have a great deal to do with biologic motion detection, human or animal motion. So these two regions important in this kind of ability to shift perspective. Now, in addition to these areas within the prefrontal cortex, also